This is the NTSB report Nashville never discussed. On March 16, 1991, at 1:43 in the morning, a Hawker Siddeley jet carrying 7 members of Reba McEntire's band, her tour manager, and a 2-man flight crew lifted off into the darkness over San Diego. 8 nautical miles later, it slammed into the side of Otay Mountain. 10 people died. The wreckage came to rest at the 3,300-foot level, 172 feet below the summit. The NTSB logged it as accident number LAX91FA132. Aviation investigators would later classify it as a controlled flight into terrain, CFYT, one of the deadliest and most preventable categories of accident in commercial aviation. For 33 years, country music has remembered this crash as a tragedy. The federal government remembers it as something else: improper planning, failure to maintain altitude, 3 radio calls in which the captain himself said on the record that the instructions he was being given would put his airplane in the wrong place. This is what really happened that night. By the spring of 1991, Reba McEntire was the most powerful woman in country music. Her tour schedule had outgrown the bus. She and her band had moved to private jets, leased through a company called Prestige Tours, headquartered in Gallatin, Tennessee. On the evening of March 15th, the band played a private concert in San Diego for executives at IBM. The next show was Fort Wayne, Indiana. 2 jets were chartered to make the run east. A third would carry Reba, her then-husband Narvel Blackstock, and her stylist Sandy Spica the following morning. Reba was fighting bronchitis, and her doctor had told her to rest. There was one problem. The planes were sitting at Lindbergh Field, San Diego's main airport, and Lindbergh had an 11 p.m. noise curfew. The IBM concert would run too long. Narvel Blackstock made the call that almost certainly saved Reba's life. He had both jets repositioned south to Brownfield Municipal Airport, a small general aviation field tucked against the mountains near the Mexican border. Brownfield had no curfew. It also had something else. Captain Donald Holms had never flown out of there before. The first phone call to the FAA flight service station came in the hour before takeoff. Donald Holms told the specialist he did not have a standard instrument departure procedure, what pilots call a SID, for Brownfield. He needed one. The terrain east of the airport rises sharply, and the Otay Mountains form a wall just minutes after liftoff. The specialist read him the departure procedures for runways 8 and 26. The second call came shortly after. Holmes still was not comfortable. He asked again. The specialist offered a suggestion. File an IFR flight plan and depart under visual flight rules. Pick up the instrument clearance from controllers once airborne. The third call was the one the public never heard. According to the transcript later released by the National Transportation Safety Board, Captain Holmes complained that the instructions he was being given would force him to fly right into the TCA, the protected airspace around Lindbergh Field. Flying into it without authorization was a federal violation. The flight service specialist's advice did not change. The NTSB later concluded in writing that the briefer had provided insufficient terrain information, including failing to convey the minimum safe altitude requirements for the departure corridor. It found that Donald Holmes was not familiar with the San Diego area, that his co-pilot Chris Hollinger was not familiar with the Hawker Siddeley aircraft itself, and that neither pilot should have departed in those conditions. Investigators later noted the co-pilot's unfamiliarity with the aircraft as a textbook failure of crew resource management, or CRM, the principle that both pilots share responsibility for monitoring the flight's safety at all times. They departed anyway. At 1:43 a.m. Pacific Time, the Hawker Siddeley DH-125, tail number November 831 Lima Charlie, rolled down Brownfield's runway 08 left. It was night. It was cold. The mountain east of the airport was invisible. The plane climbed. It turned. It never made it past the ridge. There were 8 passengers on board. Chris Austin was 27 years old. He played guitar and mandolin and sang harmony. Kirk Capello was 28, Reba's musical director, the man who built and ran her touring band and who had shaped her sound on stages across the country. Joey Ciganero was 27, keyboards. Paula K. Evans was 33, backup vocals. Terry Jackson was 28. Bass. Tony Saputo was 34. Drums. Michael Thomas was 34. Guitar. Jim Hammond was 40 years old. Reba's road manager, the man who had handed her the schedule that very afternoon and walked her through the logistics of the night. On the flight deck were Captain Donald Holms and First Officer Chris Hollinger. 10 people on board. 8 were band members. 2 were crew. Investigators later found the impact point at the 3,300-foot elevation of Otay Mountain, 172 feet below the summit. If the airplane had been climbing seconds longer, it would have cleared the ridge. It was not. The pilot of the second jet, Roger Woolsey, completed his own takeoff without incident. He was airborne when he heard the radio chatter about a missing aircraft. He landed at his next fuel stop, called Brown Field, and confirmed what he already suspected. Then he called Reba's hotel. Narvel Blackstock answered the phone. Reba was asleep in the next room, fighting bronchitis. Narvel went to find the pilot of their own jet, the man who would fly them home, to confirm the news. Then he woke his wife. 9 days later, Reba McEntire walked onto the stage of the 63rd Academy Awards and sang. The song was "I'm Checkin' Out" from the film Postcards from the Edge. Meryl Streep had performed it in the movie. Reba had been booked to perform it on television months earlier, and she kept the commitment. Vince Gill called her and offered to play her stage if she needed him. Dolly Parton offered to help rebuild the band. In October of 1991, she released a record called "For My Broken Heart," written in direct response to the crash and the grief that followed. It sold 4 million copies, and it remains the highest-selling album of her career. 8 dogwood trees were planted at her ranch. The NTSB released its final accident report on September 15, 1992, 18 months after the crash. The probable cause read like an indictment. Investigators blamed improper planning and decision by the pilot, a failure to maintain proper altitude and clearance over mountainous terrain, and the co-pilot's failure to adequately monitor the progress of the country music never absorbed this. Not in 1992, not in the autobiography, not in the Oprah interview 21 years later. The story's always been told as fate, an act of God that the Queen of Country narrowly escaped. The federal record tells a different story. The crash was preventable. 3 radio calls. 1 captain who said on tape that he was being put in the wrong place. 1 specialist whose advice did not change. 1 Hawker Siddeley jet climbed into the dark and was 172 feet short of clearing a mountain. 8 musicians. 1 tour manager. 2 pilots. A federal report no one in Nashville ever wanted to discuss. Now you know what's in it.